2019 before the UK conference, and some of the brothers confirmed that it was 2019. It's great to be back here. I saw this building when Pastor Paul had just negotiated, if I remember correctly, to lease the building, and at that time it was basically just an open warehouse. He brought us over to have a look at it. My goodness, what a building. What a fantastic achievement, fantastic building, and it really is certainly a sensational facility. And it's a great joy to see it all completed, and I believe you're getting a new roof shortly. In Fiji, this roof would be perfectly fine. I don't know why you'd want to mess with it, but there we go. The other thing I want to say is that I'm really glad you've turned on the warm weather for us. We are freezing, and so we're coming into winter. We're about 3 weeks away from winter in Perth, where we now live. We've just relocated back to Perth off the mission field, and I noticed that our days start off the same temperature as your days, but ours actually get warmer. And so there we go. What can I say? Noticing a few familiar faces. I've got to do a double take to hang on a minute. I know you. And for some of you, it's been years since I've seen you. And so if I walk past you, it's not because I'm being ignorant. I just... we've all kind of moved on a bit in life, haven't we? And so do forgive me. I'm not being rude. I just, takes a bit more brain power these days to realise who it is. And so there we go. If you have a Bible with you, turn with me, if you would, to Joshua chapter 7. We're going to start reading in verse 4. Joshua 7 verse 4. I come from a land... My birthplace is a land full of disappointments. By the way, it was the English that sent us out there to suffer, hopefully to get rid of us forever, even to die there. Many of our forefathers for the term of their natural lives. We decorated our prison cell, and today it's a great country. But I come from a land full of disappointments, so much so that many of the disappointments of the nation of Australia found their way into the names of locations where the disappointment happened. Let me give you a few examples. Misery Bay in South Australia, where you can still, apparently, I've never been there, but apparently you can still see some visible signs of the shipwreck that led to the naming of that bay, Misery Bay. This should not be confused with Misery Beach, which is in Western Australia, the state that I live in. And it seems as though it might have got its name from the whaling days, where the town of Albany, when it was in full swing of its whaling industry, used to gut the whales, and the blood and guts would wash up on Misery Beach. So they called it Misery Beach in Western Australia. Useless Loop Road. That's another interesting place. That tells another story. After a French explorer named the road and discovered that it really didn't take him anywhere important at all. By the way, Useless Loop Road is not far from Shark Bay. In fact, it's on the same peninsula, and Pastor Al would know Shark Bay really, really well. And you can imagine it was a bad time if they were both discovered on the same day. Another place that echoes human disappointment, and it is written into the name of this location, is Lake Disappointment. It's in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, in the northwest of Western Australia, the state that I live in. And it was discovered by pastoralist Frank Hann in 1897 while he was looking for an inland source of fresh water. And instead he found a salt lake which was saltier than the ocean, and hence the name Lake Disappointment. I should mention that there is also a Mount Disappointment, as well as Disappointment Hill and Disappointment Rock, all of which I think are in Western Australia. Disappointment Rock, I know, is in Norseman, Western Australia. One of the hints that Australia was going to be a land filled with disappointments was way, way back in 1616, and some of you, if you're a history of student, may remember this, when Dutch merchant and explorer Dirk Hartog landed on the island named after himself, and he nailed a tin plate or a lead plate, whatever it was, to a post that he erected on the island. And apparently, as he looked across from Dirk Hartog Island and saw mainland Australia, which is today Western Australia, he was so disappointed that he left Dirk Hartog Island and the entire continent of Australia without giving it a second thought. Apparently, old Dirk thought that the disappointment was too great on the island, no sense going across to the mainland, and he never returned. You better get used to one fact. Life is going to have its disappointments, and at times, life may even be filled with disappointments. And you better learn one thing. You better learn this. Unless, of course, you want your life to be a disappointment. You better learn how to work through them. You better learn how to handle the seasons when you are neck deep in disappointments. I heard an interesting phrase. I was listening to an interview of a young lady, or I guess now she's in her middle ages, and her name is Joanna Gaines, and she and her husband are quite famous people nowadays. And I remember in this interview she made a statement, and she was a Christian, and she was saying that God was speaking to her. She had a Korean mother, an American father, and she said, God spoke to her and said, Joe, you need to learn how to manage the disappointments of life. When I heard that statement, that resonated with me, and I thought that would be a great thing to preach a sermon on. So I want to preach to you this morning about managing disappointments. Joshua chapter 7, beginning in verse 4. This is the account of Joshua and the children of Israel going up to the city of Ai after the victory at Jericho, where the Bible says these words, so about 3,000 men went up from there from the people, but they fled before the men of Ai. And the men of Ai struck down about 36 men, so they chased them from before the gate as far as Shebarim, and struck them down on the descent. Therefore the hearts of the people melted and became like water. Then Joshua tore his clothes, fell to the earth on his face before the ark of the Lord until evening. And he and the elders of Israel put dust on their heads. And Joshua said, Alas, Lord God, why have you brought this people over the Jordan at all to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites and to destroy us? Oh, that we would have been content and dwelt on the other side of the Jordan. O Lord, what shall I say when Israel turns its back before its enemies? For the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear it and surround us and cut off our name from the earth. Then what will you do for your great name. So the Lord said to Joshua, get up. Why do you lie thus on your face? Now, I want to begin tonight by speaking, or this morning rather, by speaking about great expectations. And I want to make this statement that life should be filled with great expectations. There's no doubt about that. And to live life any other way is to live a life void of any real faith. I like what one person said when they wrote, I am an optimist. It doesn't seem to make much sense to be anything else. Maybe you ought to write that and put that on your fridge at home. I'm an optimist. It doesn't seem to make much sense to be anything else. I have to add my hearty amen to that statement. I think that the design of God is for us to live and to think like an optimist, seeing the best in everything, the possibilities, the potential, the opportunities, the prospects, the hidden fortunes of life. And I think that Joshua was probably that kind of leader, a man that saw the best, that thought the best, that believed God, that saw what God might do through his life and through his leadership. After spending 40 days with the other spies wandering through a land filled with opportunities and potential and resources, what he had was great expectations for the promised land. He saw the same things that everyone else saw, but faith led him to believe that obstacles, hindrances, these were God's problem and not his problem. He summed up his view of the promised land of Canaan by saying in Numbers chapter 14, verses 7 through 8, the land we pass through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into the land and give it to us. Joshua's statement came out of a heart that was filled with faith, that God delights in his people, and he is actually committed. Listen to me this morning. He is actually committed to helping his people. We need to not only have great expectations, but we need to act on great expectations. By the way, if you are living life as a Christian without great expectations, then you need to have some. If you're sitting here this morning and thinking, gee, I don't have any great expectations, I'm not expecting God to do anything, I don't have any dreams and visions that I'm expecting to be fulfilled, might I suggest to you this morning that you begin to remedy that problem and you begin to expect God to give you some great expectations in life and that you would see them realized. You need a faith and a confidence this morning that drives you beyond where you are right now in the will of God. And that's what drove Joshua, and that's how he lived life, and that's how he did ministry. When opportunity knocked on his door, he was ready for a date. He was ready to take up that opportunity. Verse 4, so about 3,000 men went up from there from the people. The children of Israel had just come out of a great victory. Jericho's walls had indeed tumbled down as God said that they would, and the city was left defenseless, which allowed God's people to overthrow their enemies. Here is the first city in the promised land. Faith was the key in his first great victory, and now great expectations of what lay ahead fueled him as he took the children of Israel forward. Now, hopefully your faith has been fueling some great expectations in you and driving you forward. Listen, folks, life is short. I'm aware of that. I turned 65 this past week. I'm aware of the fact that life is racing by. My days are numbered, and I have some great expectations. Hopefully, you've got some plans. Hopefully, you've got some dreams and some aspirations. There are some goals that are burning within you, and you are now on course to seeing those goals and dreams and aspirations come to pass. If you're going to live right, you can't just camp at the place of your last victory. There need to be new destinations on your map of life, and you need to be heading towards those new destinations. Again, great expectations drive us forward. They help us to have confidence in a future where God is going to meet with us and God is going to help us through the challenges of life ahead. Verse 4, so about 3,000 men went up from the people. They had great expectations. But let me balance this out for you this morning. If you have some great expectations, somewhere along the road, you are going to meet with disappointment. Somewhere along the road of your dreams, you have an appointment with disappointment. Things aren't going to go like a dream. Sometimes our dreams turn into nightmares, and they seem more like nightmares than dreams, don't they? In fact, you may have heard, you may have been heading, I should say, on a collision course with disappointment. I don't know if you've ever seen any head-on collisions, but one thing about the Fiji Islands where we lived, I often said these people are some of the worst drivers I've ever seen anywhere in the world. Unfortunately, there's this side of people in Fiji. They're very happy-go-lucky. They love to laugh and joke and have a good time. And unfortunately, when they get behind the wheel of a vehicle, they don't leave that behind. They think it's still all just fun and games or whatever. And they will take over. They'll overtake on blind bends. They'll overtake on hills. They drive very, very dangerously. They'll wander onto the wrong side of the road. We have nearly had some serious head-on collisions because of their careless driving. And I happened to see a couple of accidents, one in which a driver was on the wrong side of the road going around a bend and collected a tourist, I believe, in another vehicle. We came along just after the accident happened as they were trying to get people out of the wrecked vehicles and treat some badly injured people at the scene of the accident. There was another accident, head-on collision, where a truck carrying about 15 or 20 people, they load them in the back, they have a couple of bench seats, they sit there, very common form of transport in Fiji, and I'm not sure exactly what happened, but it collided with a minivan, and I think it was 10 people that were killed in that accident. Tragic head-on collision because someone was driving carelessly. It was a head-on collision. It was the outcome of someone being in a place where they really shouldn't have been. Now, throughout life, you are going to have some head-on collisions with the disappointments in life. And you may do your very best to avoid that. You may take every caution and every care to avoid those head-on collisions, but you're going to have them sooner or later in life. I'm not cursing you. I'm simply speaking about the reality of life. And the challenge is that you won't become a fatal victim. One of those head-on collisions, people were dead everywhere, bodies all over the place. And another one, people were injured, but they survived. Dying at the scene of a collision and being pronounced dead on arrival is a tragedy. Dead on arrival when help finally arrives. They call it DOA in Australia, dead on arrival. It would be my hope that we wouldn't find you one day after one of life's collisions, spiritually DOA, dead on arrival. Joshua needed some serious roadside help when he had his head-on collision with disappointment at the town of Ai. Now, this was supposed to be an easy battle. They'd just taken on Jericho, a walled city, a city with great walls that they couldn't scale. They had trusted God. They had obeyed God's direction for tackling the city of Jericho. They were assured of victory. And so the city of Jericho was a great victory for them, but now they were going on to Ai. Now, in a perfectly natural sense, they had seen the walls of Jericho, they had seen God move powerfully there, and so they had come to the conclusion that Ai was going to be a pushover, that this was a given, it was a definite victory. Because after all, we've seen what God had already done when they were confronted by the first very major challenge in the Promised Land. Verses 4 and 5. But they fled before the men of Ai. And the men of Ai struck down about 36 men, for they chased them from before the gate as far as Shebarim, and struck them down on the descent. Therefore the hearts of the people melted and became like water. Israel was supposed to be cutting down their enemies, taking the land, having victory, winning, conquering. Instead, they themselves were being conquered. Instead of moving forward and inheriting God's promise to his people, to Joshua, the children of Israel, they're turning away and they are now running from their dream. Verse 5, for they chased them from before the gate as far as Shebarim and struck them down on the descent. And that's the nature this morning, church, of disappointment. It makes us feel as though we're going backwards, as though we're moving away from our goals and our dreams and our destiny rather than moving towards it. It's amazing. Everything can seem to melt away because of one disappointment, just because we've been disappointed one time, just because our expectations have been dashed. Verse 5, therefore the hearts of the people melted and became like water. No strength, no determination, no fighting spirit left in them. Faith has evaporated. Not a single cut on most of these men. But nonetheless, here they are. Jericho fueled their faith, but small, insignificant Ai has deflated them. How are you going to respond when you eventually collide with disappointment? Joshua gives us a classic response to disappointment. And there are 4 specific reactions that we see here. Firstly, we see that Joshua allowed the whole world to see how disappointed he really was. And that's a mistake. When our hopes have been dealt a serious blow, to let the whole world see openly and unrestrained how disappointed we are. Verse 6 says, then Joshua tore his clothes. You know, we need to be able to maintain our composure during life's setbacks. Not everyone needs to know that we've had a setback and a disappointment and life hasn't gone well for us, that we've had a collision with a heartache or a heartbreak. In Australia, we play Australian rules football. I know it's different to your football here in England. But there was an interesting situation where a coach of the main team in Western Australia where I live, his name's John Worsfold, or he was the main coach, the head coach. And he had taken that team to a number of grand finals in his tenure as the coach of the team there. And in this particular instance, he took them to another grand final. and they were about a quarter of the way through the match. They have like a quarter time, half time, and 3/4 time, so there's 4 quarters in the match. And about a quarter of the way through the match, the Eagles, the team that he's coaching, are doing absolutely atrociously. And I'm sure that Worsfold was powerfully unhappy with his team. They put an enormous amount of effort into coaching them, preparing them psychologically and physically. And he walks out on the ground at quarter time and he meets with the team on the ground as the coaches do. And here's the whole nation. They're watching Worsfold meeting with his team at quarter time. And Worsfold, like a true champion that he was, remained calm. He remained composed. He got down to business. He didn't tear his clothes. He didn't start shouting and screaming and jumping up and down. He managed his disappointment privately and well and dealt with his team that should have been a winning team with great composure. Verse 6, let's look at Joshua. And he fell to the earth on his face. So that leads us to the second thing that Joshua did. Joshua lay down. Disappointment killed his forward momentum. He was making a statement about moving forward. He lay down. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not playing anymore. I'm taking my bat and my ball and I'm going home. The third thing that we see happening here in verse 6, he and the elders of Israel, they put dust on their heads. Now here we see thirdly, that after laying down, he's making a statement. He's putting dust on his head along with the elders of Israel. And in this, he's saying, you can bury me right here. This is it. It was an act of grief. I understand culturally what this meant, but it had tones or overtures of the idea that you can bury me here, you can hide me here, I'm done with this, this plan is over for me. He threw dust on his head. But then we see the fourth thing that happens, verse 7. And Joshua said, Alas, Lord God, why have you brought this people over the Jordan at all to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites and to destroy us? So what we see fourthly happening here is that Joshua blamed God for this disappointment as though it was God's fault. And isn't that so often what we also do in life? We blame God for our disappointments. Have you ever said in a time of disappointment, God, if you really loved me, why don't you? What you're doing is you're blaming God. If God really loved you, excuse me? Isn't that what the cross was about? If God never did another thing for us, church, but he simply saved us. If we lived a life of misery from the point of salvation, and thankfully we don't, or at least we shouldn't. If we lived a life of misery from the point of salvation until the time we made heaven our home, it would be more than enough. Allow me to point out this simple fact. You can't avoid some disappointments in life. They're going to happen. It's part of living in a fallen world, and it's part of the reality of life itself. You need to get used to the fact, the reality. You need to prepare for it, that life is surely going to bring you on a collision course with some serious disappointments. It may be in marriage. It may be in finances. It may be in ministry. It may be with children, either young children or adult children. It may be with work and career. It may be some of the ambitions and dreams that you've had. Fill in the blank. Life is going to serve up some disappointments to you. They will come. And if you can't avoid them, then what you would need to really do, if you're wise, is learn how to be prepared for them and learn how to cope with them. Look, I've said something to people for many, many years, and this came basically out of just the experiences of life and seeing the way that life goes. I've said to disciples in the Suva church that I pastored for many years, I've said to friends, I've said to fellow pastors who have gone through miserable times, I've said, listen, you're not going to be up forever and you're not going to be down forever. Learn to work through the ups and downs, the wins and the losses of life. They're going to come. So let's conclude this morning as I tie together a few of these thoughts. And I want to speak to you about the main thought here in this sermon, which is managing disappointment. Seeing beyond, listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. Seeing beyond disappointment is essential. Now, Australia might have been a land of disappointments. There's no doubt about that. The first explorers, the first people that went there, I've read many of their accounts. For many of them, it was sheer misery. Britain knew what it was doing when it sent its criminals out to Australia to begin to colonize Australia and live life out there. It was definitely an arduous life, a difficult life. It was definitely a punishment for those early people. And the reality is Australia was a land of disappointments. But in reality, listen to me, generations of people have learned to work through them. And they have become some of the great opportunities for the people of the nation. According to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the Australian economy, last time I checked at least, was the 12th strongest in the world. Now that might not sound like anything. This is according to the benchmark report. That may not sound like a big deal. But it's pretty astonishing when you consider the fact that Australia is ranked 55th in terms of global population. There's only 25 million people in that country, but it by far outranks more populous nations around the world. It is 5th in the world for wheat production. It is the world's, today, largest wool producer. When it comes to mining, it takes out a number of first prizes. Australia is the world's largest exporter of coal, 35%, last time I checked at least. You can Google me if you like and check, but this is when I checked and did my study. 35% of international trade in coal comes from Australia. It is the world's largest export of iron ore and lead and diamonds and rutile and zinc and zirconium. It is the second largest exporter and miner in the world of gold and uranium, and it is the third largest when it comes to aluminium or bauxite, if you like. Australia is also the 5th largest exporter of natural gas in the world. Now, I could go on, but I think you get the idea. What am I trying to do here? Am I trying to wave the Australian flag? No, I didn't bring a flag this morning. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying it was a nation birthed in the midst of many disappointments. And generations of people have learned how to work through those disappointments and turn them into opportunities. They've become lessons for life. Verse 10 of our text, so the Lord said to Joshua, "Get up. Why do you lie thus on your face?" Now, allow me to say this to you this morning. Maybe you are right now in the midst of disappointment. I have no idea what's going on in your life. I haven't been told anything. But maybe right now you are in the midst of disappointment. Can I give you a word from God? Why are you on your face? Get up. You're not going to be up forever, and you're not going to be down forever. Life has its ebb and flow. Realize this: God allows disappointments. And that's because they teach us some of the most valuable lessons in life that we earn. Can you imagine how arrogant we would be if everything we did in life just worked perfectly? No one would be able to tell you anything. Discipleship wouldn't work. Disappointment is not the end, but many times it is actually a portal to becoming a greater man, a greater woman of God. It's a turning point in your journey through life. Disappointments are not the end. In fact, many times they are the beginning of a new level of understanding and a new level of advancement and a new level of ministry in God. They teach us how to handle and how to deal with, how to work through life in a better, a wiser, and a more intelligent fashion. They also force us to focus on our problems. Disappointments force us to work through and find a solution many times to what seems an unsolvable problem. In other words, disappointments develop us. But more than anything, our disappointments cause us to look to God. They cause us to begin to cry out and say, "God, I don't understand this. This is spinning my head out, God." So here is the question we have to ask ourselves. What am I going to do with my disappointments? We all have the ability and the capacity to handle life's setbacks poorly, and I'm sure that most of us could share testimony of the fact that we've done that on occasions, not a few. But if we do, God can't enrich us and God can't advance us. Joseph was the master of handling life's disappointments and setbacks, and rather than being set back, every disappointment that Joseph faced actually propelled him further forward into the plan of God. Genesis 39 verse 4, so Joseph found favor in his sight and served him, and then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. You see, the reality is that your disappointments, God can actually use to take you forward if you'll keep your heart right. It really boils down to nothing more. Disappointments might knock you down, but I say this to you, don't stay down. Don't lay down. Don't decide to set up camp there because you've been knocked down. Verse 10, so the Lord said to Joshua, "Get up. Why do you lie thus on your face?" Lying on your face is a terrible position to take up if you want to move forward. You ever thought about that? It doesn't really equip you for being in a posture for a good vision of what lay ahead. If you are wise, you will learn from the disappointments of life. They are some of life's best teachers and lessons, and disappointment is one of the best opportunities that can actually happen to you. Allow the setbacks that you have to teach you, to enlarge you, to equip you, and to help you in moving forward into God-ordained success. Bring them to God and trust that God will be able to show you what to do with those disappointments and exactly how to handle them. You know, one of the great locations that was named, I mentioned it in the beginning of this sermon, is Lake Disappointment. It was discovered by Frank Hahn, or Han, I think his name is, in 1897. And what was seen by Frank Hahn as a hopeless disappointment in 1897 has recently been confirmed as the largest sulfate of potash deposit in the entire nation. And for those of you that don't know what SOP is, it's not son of a pig, by the way. Sulfate of potash is actually fertilizer, and it is an extremely high-grade fertilizer. So get the picture here, church. Here's this pastoralist. He runs livestock. What was nothing more than a bitter disappointment for one man is now being used as a high-grade fertilizer by another generation. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? And maybe God could turn some of your disappointments into what might become a high-grade fertilizer for the future, causing you and others to grow, causing your life to receive a boost that will cause you to really take off and become something you've never been before. We will only know by making a commitment to manage our disappointments. And I want to challenge you to do just that. Let's bow our heads this morning and close our eyes for a few moments, shall we? Our heads are bowed, our eyes are closed. I certainly appreciate you being